and I'll have Esther begin. She has a PowerPoint, which will run about 20-25 minutes. I'm going to ask you to just type any question you have on the side. She can see it. I can let her know. And so you can type at any time that you're thinking or want to ask her something. She'll present, and then we'll have a chance to just chat and explore some of these topics together. And then this video will be archived and placed on the TESOL website. So without further ado, I welcome Esther, and I'm going to let her, she's going to hit her share screen, and we're going to see her PowerPoint, but we'll still see us over on the side. So if you can kind of see, there'll be two windows opening on your computer. Okay. Awesome.
Fabulous. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or evening, depending on probably where you're at. So I'm Esther de Jong at the University of Florida. I'm also have the honor this year of being TESOL President-Elect, and so even doubly happy to be here. What I thought I would do today is just kind of give a series of vignettes, if you will, of research that we've done here in Florida around the topic of mainstream pre-service teacher preparation for working with English language learners. I don't have to tell you anymore, I think, with this audience. Let's see if I can make this work. Uh-oh. There you go. That given the demographics here in the United States, that there is a real need for mainstream teacher preparation, and that we have, as of now, very much an insufficient teacher preparation model. There's very few states that require extensive teacher preparation for mainstream teachers to work with second language learners, which puts an interesting burden on colleges of education, initial teacher preparation programs to kind of figure out what to do. How do we best prepare second language teachers to work with second language learners? You can see here some of the data that kind of reinforces that. So Florida is a very unique context for this, so it's really important to understand. We were one of the first states to have quite stringent and strong requirements for mainstream teacher preparation that started with a Florida consent decree in 1990 that focused on practicing teachers. That was in service. When teachers would be a mainstream teacher, they would work with ELLs in their classroom, and that started a clock for professional development for elementary teachers and for secondary teachers. In 2001, that requirement moved to teacher preparation programs. So initial teacher preparation programs got the same mandate that if you were in a college of education and teachers were certified as elementary teachers or secondary teachers, you had to prepare them with a certification and what is called an ESOL endorsement. Now, the ESOL endorsement is the equivalent of 300 hours of professional development. They are aligned with the TESOL standards domains. So it includes applied linguistics, it includes cross-cultural communication, ESOL methods, ESOL curriculum and materials, and ESOL assessment. And all of that content had to be put into initial teacher preparation programs. Putting 5 courses into an existing program was difficult, and there's limitations as to how many credits students can take at the undergraduate level. And so most teacher preparation programs do a model called an ESOL-INFUSED model. And what that meant was that they had 2 courses as a minimum, courses that were standalone courses to meet all of those requirements, the ESOL standard. And all of the other information, content, knowledge and skills related to English language learners was what we call infused into the teacher preparation programs. And there was a field experience requirement. What that means is that when students graduate from for example, an elementary teacher preparation program, they graduate with a teacher certification and they graduate with an ESOL endorsement, and that qualifies them fully to work with English language learners in Florida. So as you can see, there's a very strong mandate for teacher preparation for ELLs here in Florida that is not visible in all other states, and that makes a big difference. It's a high bar that we have to follow. So what we've done, and these are kind of the three areas that I want to talk about, is we've done different studies over the last number of years that I thought I would kind of touch on, just to kind of raise some questions and topics in this webinar that hopefully we can then follow up on and have some more discussion about. The first one focuses on what is it that mainstream teachers need to know and be able to do. The second one asks the question, so what happens after students graduate from our programs, an ESOL-INFUSE program? Are they actually using the practices that we talk to them about in our program? And then currently we're working on looking much more closely at that infusion process, both in terms of the content as well as in terms of faculty development. So I'm going to kind of walk you through those circles. And as I said, I'm not going to go in all the depth that all of these topics require, but just kind of touch on them, just to kind of highlight a few issues, some findings, and hopefully spark some discussion at the end. So the first one is this notion of what is it that mainstream teachers need to know and be able to do. And Candace Harper and I have done a lot of work trying to figure out what it is that they need to know, and particularly challenging what we have called the ESL is just good teaching myth. And for those of you who've been working with mainstream teachers, you've probably encountered this, where basically they say, well, it's just good teaching. And if you work with ELLs and you're doing good teaching practices, you can meet the needs of ELLs. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, if it's more than that, then what is it that is more? What is so distinct about working with ELLs that goes beyond what it would be to be a good teacher? So in the original article in 2005 that Candace Harper and I wrote in the Teacher Education Quarterly, we said, well, there's really a kind of a knowledge and skill gap, if you will. Mainstream teachers know certain things, but they really need to also understand something real specific understandings about language and culture and the role that language and culture plays in education, because that's really where their understanding of English language learners will be met. And so we talked about understanding the process of language learning, knowing that language and culture also function as a medium of learning, the assumptions that we have in our classrooms around language and culture, and that needs to be mediated, right? Mediating in terms of, for example, the language demands in the classroom. And then lastly, the importance of language and culture as a goal of instruction. It's not sufficient to simply expose students to, let's say, English. We also really need to teach them English, and especially right now with the Common Core and much more emphasis on academic discourses, that notion of focusing our instruction on actually teaching the language and cultural differences and cross-cultural competence becomes really, really important. So those understandings lead to more effective practices for English language learners. And as we note in this article, we said, you know, you can have the knowledge base, but you also need to have the disposition base to make all of this work. All three pieces need to work together. A number of years later, based on another study that we did with practicing teachers and looking back on the program, we said all of those pieces are very true, but we also realized that one of the things that we needed to add to that idea of what is it that mainstream teachers need to be able to do is the notion of mainstream experiences. So on the one hand, you need to have a good understanding of bilingual learners and their linguistic experiences. You need to have that knowledge and the skills related to the role of language and culture. But then also, as a mainstream teacher in particular, what comes to you are policies that are framed around native English speakers. And so one of the skills that we need to pay attention to is how can we help mainstream teachers negotiate these native speaker norms and these native speaker curricula and material and assessments for the benefit of the second language learners that they're working with. So we added that as kind of another component to our model. So that's one area that we kind of been thinking about, and I'd love to hear some ideas from you as well in terms of what you find is most important to make sure that mainstream teachers learn and understand. So the second bubble comes out of a U.S. Department of Education grant where we looked at what happens with graduates from our program once they go into practice. And so with Maria Cody and Candace Harper, we had Project Delta, that stands for Developing English Language and Literacy Through Teacher Achievement, which was a post-training assessment grant. It was quite unique within that round. We're very grateful that the DOE kind of took that as a chance to look at this. And so we did not focus for that grant on our program and what we did within the program, but we looked at the graduates of our program. What is it? What are their sense of that we prepare them well to work with English language learners? How efficacious do they feel when they're working with English language learners? And are they engaging in the practices that we would like them to engage in? So that's kind of the nature of that project. And we used a mixed method design for that project. And so that included a very quantitative piece working with what is called the Education Data Warehouse, which here in Florida houses millions of records related to teachers and students. And that allowed us to look at the academic achievement of ELLs that were taught by our graduates. We also surveyed them, interviewed them, and we kind of had focal teachers that we used to get a sense of particular practices. So I want to highlight two areas in terms of our findings there. One is from the survey, because I think it's interesting to look and see what is it, as we ask them about what do you feel most and least prepared for, and what do you feel most and least efficacious about when it comes to teaching second language learners. And you can see the results here on the slide. And it was interesting to see that graduates were much more comfortable in the area of comprehension and sheltering their instruction and making instruction more comprehensible. And they felt a lot less secure about using the student's native language and very kind of the linguistic aspects of the structure of English and how to teach that. And that was a pattern that we had found also with surveys that we had done while students were still in our program. So this is a very consistent trend that we've seen as an area that much more comfortable with making a welcoming environment, comprehensible input, much less comfortable with the linguistic aspects of that. So that kind of gives a nice signal to us in terms of making sure that we pay more attention to that or maybe pay different attention to this. Another interesting finding was that students' ability to speak a language other than English and or having had really diverse experiences growing up really made a difference in terms of what they got out of the program and how prepared they felt. And through the interviews, we found out that they felt they had a much greater empathy for the English learners, and they felt that they could much better understand what it takes to learn another language. The case studies were also very powerful. So we selected about 8 focal teachers, and we wanted to kind of see what is it that you're doing and how are you accommodating for your English language learners. And our recent article in the TESOL Quarterly really focuses in on one of those case studies. And one of the things that we realized was that the extent of practices was kind of challenged sometimes by contextual factors. Sometimes the district said you have to do something, and the teachers didn't have a lot of choice. But the other thing that we realized was, even though the teachers very much emphasized that the students were part of their classroom, so it was an inclusion classroom in the sense of ELLs were included physically and within the classroom community, that the practices of the teachers were not always inclusionary. Oftentimes, the teacher would address the whole group without worrying too much about the second language learner, and then go maybe one-on-one instruction to support the English language learner. There were some cultural pieces that we found that were missed opportunities. Missed opportunities to make cross-cultural, cross-linguistic connections for the English language learners and for the other students. And so we kind of pushed that agenda a little bit further and say, you know, how can we think about inclusionary practices for ELLs, and what does that mean in terms of teacher preparation? So that's my second bubble to be thinking about. What is it that happens with the students after the program? And I think we'll see more and more studies looking into that. So current work that we're engaged in right now is around this infusion components. If you remember from the intro, the infusion part of our elementary teacher preparation program is the part that is not in the ESOL specific courses. The ESOL specific courses focus exclusively on English language learners. They are taught by ESOL faculty. But these are in courses where there's an expectation that faculty address issues related to English language learners according to the teacher professional development standards, whether it relates to the domain of culture, the domain of second language acquisition, the domain of methods, curriculum, or assessment. So those standards and indicators are kind of distributed throughout the program for a very good reason. You know, it's not just one moment that pre-service teachers get to hear about ELLs, but it's really throughout the program that we want to send the message. You are a teacher for all learners, and that explicitly includes English language learners. So within this infusion component, we realized that even though Florida has had this infusion for almost 15 years, right, since 2001, we really know very little about what that looks like, how that is being implemented, and what the experiences are of both the ESOL faculty that is involved in the infusion, as well as the general education faculty who is expected to infuse all of this knowledge into their coursework. So a couple of years ago, we started thinking about and collecting data on kind of three elements of this. One is curricular change. How do the faculty kind of include these standards in their coursework? The second one is related to professional development for general education faculty. And the third one is related to what impact do the ESOL field experiences have as part of the elementary teacher preparation program, which is the focus of the studies. So I'll highlight a few elements of this. So the first one was basically what we said, what are the realities of the ESOL infusion? So we interviewed a number of faculty that was responsible for this infusion in their coursework, and we essentially said, listen, this is not an evaluation, but we really want to know what is happening so that we understand what is happening in the infused courses, and we have a way then of thinking about what we need to do in the ESOL specific courses, so we can have a good balance between the two. And it was a really interesting process of analyzing syllabi to kind of see whether and how English language learners and addressing specific standards related to English language learners were addressed through readings or through assignments. And you see kind of the syllabus checklist that we use to kind of look at a syllabus to make sure that it's visible. It's visible to the instructor, it's visible to the student as to what it is that needs to be covered and addressed in the syllabus. So some of the highlights from that was that, in fact, a lot of these formal pieces, putting ELLs and readings in the syllabus, the standards, having specific activities that focus on English language learners, all were happening in these INFUSE courses. And so that was really nice to see that that is kind of now kind of part and parcel of these courses as part of the program. Lesson plans were core in all of this. The methods classes where students have to do lesson plans. So the notion of accommodations for English language learners was one of the major ways that the needs of English language learners were being addressed. What we found, though, that accommodations often was like one big category of accommodations. And oftentimes the accommodations for English language learners were conflated with the accommodations for any struggling reader or students with special needs. And I think the quote that you see here is a really good kind of summary of that perception and attitudes. And so again, for us, that gave us some pause and say, well, how can we then help everybody understand that when you differentiate for English language learners, that may in fact look differently than when you differentiate for other groups. And of course, second, in our field, we've worked very hard to separate out that English language learners are students with special needs. And so that's kind of a piece that we'll continue to separate out. The other challenge that we realize that we have to kind of think about is that what happens in terms of the infusion varies greatly from instructor to instructor, depending on their professional experiences. So that for a program where there's a lot of turnover with instructors, it really poses a question of how do you keep that infusion at a certain level of quality. The other challenge that we noticed was that because here in Gainesville in Florida, at the University of Florida, our surrounding community does not have a large English language learner population. And so that means that the opportunities for our students to interact and work with English language learners are quite limited. And so what happens in many of the general education classes is that in order to meet this requirement of infusing the thinking about English language learners, is that some kind of a generic ELL emerges. So the assignment is assigned to the students, but they haven't really worked with a second language learner. And so they have to kind of come up with this hypothetical ELL, as we call them. And oftentimes we found that hypothetical ELL was a beginner ELL. So it's a very specific imagery that is being promoted, if you will, within the INFUSE component. So that's just giving us a lot of food for thought, right, in terms of what is it that we need to do in our standalone courses for ESOL, as well as how can we support faculty in what they're doing. So the second study, which is ongoing right now, is that we're looking at the faculty development requirement. Again, a very unique component for Florida. Where the Department of Education actually has said, we understand that if you are expected to infuse content, ELL-related content in your courses, that you may not necessarily know how to do that. So you need to have some professional development, and the professional development needs to be about 45 hours. And so one of the questions that we've been asking over the past year is, what is it that different universities here in Florida are doing with this 45-hour professional development for general education faculty? And we're still in the process of collecting data. We have surveyed the different state universities here in the state, and we're now halfway through interviewing faculty. But some preliminary results give some food for thought. So when we asked the ESOL faculty, who's in charge of doing the professional development, about, so how prepared do you think your colleagues are to actually address the ESOL standards? They all said they were not prepared. So the idea that we need to think about general teacher educator preparation is a really important one. We also asked them what they thought were the topics that were most challenging for general education faculty to infuse in their courses. And it's interesting to look here that, again, if you think about it, the language component is what is most challenging. Questions about culture, question about general methods, that's not where the challenge is for these general education faculty, but it is in the language-specific elements. And so we see that what happened with our students, the pre-service students, we see the same kind of challenge happening with the faculty. So, you know, linguistics and linguistic analysis and understanding the structure of language is, of course, something that we as ESL teacher or bilingual teachers bring to the table. And it is an expertise that is very necessary and that we can claim as part of our professionalism. What we're doing right now with that particular project is that we're, as I said, we're interviewing faculty across the state about what is happening, what seems to work. This is not all negative. What seems to work, what challenges do they encounter, and what format do they put their professional development in. Very interesting piece, interesting tensions that we are finding along the way. So finally, the third one, and I think Jong is on the webinar, and he's one of the key doctoral students who's working with me on this one. We're looking at the impact of the field experiences. So there's a small set of hours that our students work with English language learners as part of their ESOL coursework. And so we were very interested to simply find out what do they learn from these field experiences and how can we enhance their efficacy with English language learners. We're still kind of in the middle of analyzing those data. But again, some interesting things that we're finding is that the vision or the imagery that our pre-service teachers are kind of picking up on as they are doing these placements is that they see English language learners as struggling learners, and it's the language barrier that makes them different, and that's the barrier that needs to be overcome, and they do see it as their responsibility to help them overcome. We don't hear them talk a lot about bilingual learners as resources, so that is something that we're thinking about more and figuring out what to do with that. The second piece that has been emerging is that because these are mainstream classrooms sometimes, they don't report observing a lot of strategies that we would consider more specifically targeted to second language learners. One-on-one instruction, just like we found in our Delta project, is one of the major accommodations. And I would put out there that doing one-on-one instruction as your major accommodation may create an inclusion environment, but may not necessarily be an inclusive environment for English language learners. And again, we see this emphasis on comprehensible input. So again, the language component and the explicit culture component is something that keeps kind of coming up as an area that we really need to figure out how to pay attention to better. What we're doing right now this semester is we are trying micro-teaching as a way of kind of countering a little bit before the students go into their field placements, to see if we can help strengthen their use of strategies so that even if they don't observe it, they themselves can engage in it and feel comfortable engaging with it. So to sum up with these three components that we've been thinking about, lessons from Florida, if you will, I think the first one is that we have to go beyond the basics of second language acquisition and cross-cultural competence. I think the importance of getting to know your students from a linguistic and cultural resource perspective, but also go beyond that to the role of advocacy and being able to negotiate and explain why, as a teacher, you do something is a really important component. I think from our Delta project, looking at post-training, I think the notion of context is something that we want to explore further and really begin that conversation about how do we make what is intended to be an inclusion classroom a place where inclusive practices are happening, and how do we prepare our teachers to do that? And then lastly, in terms of our infusion, I think we're still kind of trying to figure out how we can bring asset perspectives into the program when it comes to bilingual learners. And one of the challenges that comes through the infusion program is the overall depth of preparation. How well prepared can we really prepare mainstream teachers in an infused program model? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening. I'll give it back to Laura.
All right. Thank you, Esther. I have a lot of thoughts from what you shared, and I'm going to ask anyone who'd like to pose a question to place it in the group chat box, because there's a lot of people now on, and if I unmute everybody, it could get very noisy in the room. So feel free to use your chat box and start typing in some questions. I think, you know, you touched on so many interesting studies, and I want to just emphasize that this is a special kind of a community, because we are people who do the same work that you do, maybe in different contexts and with different kinds of constraints and different kinds of resources. But it's not like we're talking to mainstream teacher educators right now. We're in a community that really understands, and it's a safe place to bring up some of the things that we would like to see happen, and how we could better work in our own institutions. You've obviously been incredibly successful at bringing understanding of ELL instruction to your colleagues, and I think a lot of us would like to do that better. So this was very rich, and some of the studies you have, I'm particularly really interested in the fieldwork piece, so I'd love to ask about that, but I don't want to hog it. I see there's a question from Heather. So she's asking about how can we as TESOL folk work with ed faculty to infuse ELL concerns in pedagogy while making sure the information shared is accurate. So Heather, I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, sorry.
Tell us a little more about what you mean, because there sounds like there's something in there that maybe is that those TESOL ideas, which are based on research, they're also practices. Somehow when they get over to mainstream faculty, it becomes again like it's just good teaching from the faculty and then down. So I'm reading into it, but tell us more what you were thinking.
No, and that's really close. And I'm sorry, I just took a bite as you unmuted me.
Sorry.
But no problem. It's lunchtime here. So yes, I mean, it sort of feels like I'm in a university where I am the one and only TESOL person, and it sort of feels like I'm giving up control of my little part of the world. But it also is that, like, you know, convincing all these education faculty that, right, it's not just good teaching, and sort of how do we, like, I'm sort of envisioning myself going to the education dean and saying, hey, let's try this infusion model, but then how do I get the buy-in where I can present myself as the expert to say, hey, let's do this curriculum together. And then after it's done, say I do get that, after it's done, how can I sort of maintain a little bit of that control and make sure it's still being passed on? And I think, that's definitely the question there.
That's a really good one. I'll let Esther. What do you think of that, Esther?
Let us wrestle with that one. You know, one of the things that we're doing as part of the faculty development project is that we looked at what other institutions have done. We don't have a lot of research on that, but one of the things that's very clear is that it has to be like everybody is involved kind of an initiative. So at some level, you know, if it's you doing it, there needs to be some legitimizing of your role within that. Since this is a safe community, you know, when we started this project, when I started as an assistant professor, you know, that's a very different role than I have now as a full professor. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very real, and I've heard that in different places. So to get senior faculty buy-in is really important. And if it's not senior faculty, then it is really like the dean saying, this is important to the college. So it becomes a mission of the entire college, not just an individual. One of the things that we have the luxury of having what we call an ESOL infusion coordinator. It's a part-time person, but really her role is to really work with the faculty. So that helps tremendously, right? So somebody dedicated to this. But we also have standards around this. So we actually can sit down with faculty and say, well, here are the ESOL standards. Which one of those standards fits your class? And we, here in Florida, we create matrices for that. And then you can have a conversation around, so what does this look like in your course? And then one of the things that we're finding is that working with a faculty member one-on-one on the syllabus is the most powerful impact. So our infusion coordinator does a lot of guest lectures initially. So she shows what it could be and what it could look like. And then she basically hands the materials over to the instructor. And that, because the syllabus is so specific and explicit, it kind of stays with the syllabus. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little bit, not complete quality control, but there's some quality control as we're kind of formalizing this. And in fact, what we're working on this coming year is to turn some of those guest lectures into webinars with like workshop materials. So it's kind of like, you can do this as a general educator. But it definitely is giving up control. And so what I think we're trying to figure out is which areas are okay and best suited to the general education classes, and what are the pieces that we really need to do. Like this notion of language objectives that is so hard for everybody, I really feel that's with us, right? That's not something I would expect really to be addressed very well in the other classes. Mm-hmm. But the concept of cooperative learning or comprehensible input, I think we could work with the faculty around differentiating that, for example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I had one very quick follow-up. Oh, are you all a state that is using CAPE accreditation? Okay. Yep. And so your infusion, students who go through infusion, for that program is also being accredited by CAPE? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And in fact, it allows you to actually demonstrate, if you do it well and you do it throughout the program, that diversity component on CAPE is much better documented because you're infusing. Right. Now, I have to say that for us, infusion is really the two components. And I think what my sense is from the literature and our own work is that you have to have both. So sometimes the discussion is, should you have a standalone course or should you infuse? And I think we're finding you have to do both. So there's a place for both. It doesn't have to be an either or.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you.
Welcome.
Standalone and infused. Please feel free to post any questions. I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned this person who's sort of like an infusion coordinator who can keep up the work. Because one of the things I was wondering about is like fatigue, maybe how their experience is this as a sole, TESOL person. I have other TESOL faculty, but they're not K-12 people. Mm-hmm. So it's, I really am almost become that only person, and I'm in a context where people are very open to it. It's a very multilingual faculty, serving a community in New York City of many, many ELLs. And yet, again, the language piece is not there. And I've done these things with going into classes and then giving over modules, but I wind up, there's a lot of new faculty. We have so many adjuncts. And so I like this idea of something that gets placed inside the syllabus as sort of a core module that TESOL folks create. That sounds like a really good solution. How have you dealt with just, scale and maintaining and not this sort of sense of fatigue? And I think the teacher educator, we experience what ESL teachers in K-12 settings experience, marginalization, it's always for us to reach out, and we always need administration to back us. How do you kind of keep going?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've done is we started out with for example, the professional development piece, the 45 hours, as being extraordinarily individualized. And so a couple of years ago, we stopped doing that. And at this point, it is the 45 hours are these 3 modules. And they're online.
Okay, so that helps.
And each of those result in an assignment that relates back to the course. So the instructor takes the online course, does an assignment. So it's self-paced in that sense. There's a beginning point where we have an orientation and kind of make people aware. And then they do the 3 modules. And then there's an end point where they sit down with, in our case, again, the infusion coordinator, where they say, well, this is what I've done. At least they've gone through the process of reading and thinking through what does it mean for their course that they're teaching. So that's one way that I think it has helped tremendously, because it's just standardized. The other thing we've done is that every single course has essentially a folder of readings attached to it at this point.
Okay.
That like every other year or so, we really upgrade. So even if you have a new person coming in, they get the syllabus, they know what standards they have to address, they have a set of readings that belong to that course to address that standard, and then they have to do the PD. So there's a lot of kind of existing pieces to this that are stable. So it doesn't matter if you're a new person or not, because it's all in an online environment and you can access it. So I think that helps.
It's amazing. I can't believe your state has that requirement with it. We got to get with it in New York. All right, you got another question. Christina, I'm going to unmute you. If you would like to ask it, asking about helping pre-service teachers become advocates for ELLs. You want to say a little more about that? Christina, I've unmuted you if you'd like to add. Oh, there you go.
Me? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Great.
Hi.
Hello.
So here at University of Maryland, we've started incorporating, there's one course that all our elementary ed majors have to take as part of their certification. And within this course, we've done a lot with cultural competence, but one thing that we really need to do is to help our teacher candidates feel like they can advocate for English language learners. How do you move from just understanding what it may be like or developing an empathy to actually advocacy?
Yeah.
Nice.
It's a really good question, and I think it varies tremendously in terms of how much people can do. But one of the things that we've been really trying to push our pre-service teachers to do is to be a lot clearer as to why they do what they do for English language learners. So, for example, if they are being given a ready-made reading curriculum or a math curriculum, and you say, okay, here you have it. Is this appropriate for the ELLs at a particular proficiency level, for example? And they're like, well, no, they now know that that's not appropriate. So then the question, so what are you going to do? And how would you articulate that to, say, the principal who's going to question you? Why are you not doing X, Y, Z? And I think at minimum for them to be able to articulate their instructional choices and being able to say, this is the reason why I have to do things differently. I think this advocacy at a very local level, and I think sometimes we need to start there with them. It's like there's things that you can do in your classroom through the decisions that you make that you have control over. And so I talk a lot with my students around the fact that they are language decision makers as part of their classroom, and that those choices really matter. So thinking about the role of the native language in the classroom, the role of materials in the classroom, all of those to me are acts of advocacy. Them talking to their peers about English language learners and what is happening with them and what works for them is advocacy. So I try to kind of break it down from you have to go to the State House to be an advocate, which is one level of advocacy, is that on a day-to-day basis you can make decisions to do that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions that anyone wants to pop in there? Okay. Yes. Instructional versus political. Can I ask a little more about, because I think what would be very powerful is to be able to go to faculty and say, if you do infuse, or if you place this module as a self-contained unit on ELLs or whatever, it can affect the academic achievement of ELLs in the schools of your teacher candidates. So that side of your study where you had the quantitative data, were you able to find, it's so impossible to do that kind of study, I am amazed, so I just want to know if I can use something you've done, were you able to find any relationships between the preparation related to ELL instruction and impact on those students?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the yes part is we were able to compare the students that went through the INFUSE program and those that were before in our own program. And the answer to that one was yes. You know, the scores were significantly different. What we couldn't do is compare our students with other graduates from other programs because we didn't have access to those data.
Mm-hmm.
What we did find, though, is that the overall average score on the standardized tests for the ELLs in our graduate classrooms was definitely higher than the ELLs across the state.
Wow.
I think these are two really positive pieces that when we track our students from our program, we do see that they do relatively well with English language learners. But you have to overlay that with where do they teach, how many ELLs are there, and you know, one of the actually really interesting questions I think I would love to explore if you have enough variation is how does the number of ELLs that you have in your classroom matter in terms of the kinds of practices that you engage in? You know, here up where we are, it's easy to have just a few ELLs as a teacher.
Yeah.
When you go down to South Florida, you may have a full classroom, even though you're mainstream teacher, you're full classroom. But there's gradations within that, right? And so it's interesting to kind of think about if you have 2 ELLs in your classroom, it may be less likely that you engage in certain practices because it really is this extra step that you have to make, or at least in your mind, that's what you have to do. Whereas if you have a whole group of ELLs, it may be more in the front of your mind almost to do that as part of your planning as opposed to an afterthought in planning. So that's an interesting one.
That's good though. I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm just going to use that without any caveats when I tell people that it's important. It matters. Okay, so maybe our last question. How do you get professors who don't have this background to buy into it when they don't feel comfortable and they don't feel prepared, or even they don't see the value?
You know, that's an interesting question. So more and more we actually see that we have more recent instructors being much more positive about doing this. We also have a lot of doctoral students teaching for us, and they're like, well, of course we need to know this.
Yeah.
But as we're talking to people around the state about challenges, it's content on the one hand, but I think, and this is what Tia references to, in fact, I just completed an interview around this. It's the discomfort with engaging in issues that are, for example, related to immigration, the politics of teaching English language learners. That's where the discomfort comes from. And sometimes that's because they have not experienced it. Sometimes it's because they do have maybe different ideas around that, and they don't quite know how to handle that. So that's certainly like the politics of ELL education is something that we have to figure out better, because it's not just knowledge about. It definitely is. I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think that's well, this is where education, we live in the community, this is a human endeavor. So all of the biases, the feelings, I mean, I think that the thing that we want to really emphasize at the end of this is this bilingualism, multilingualism as a resource. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we still hear this first step is sort of faculty saying, well, yes, we don't want these poor kids to have this language barrier. You know, if they just learned English, they would be better. So, okay, I'll work on that in my, my teachers' classrooms. But it's like, and you want to say to them, and what other languages do you speak, but okay, so, someone liked it. They're off to class. Wonderful. Any last thoughts, Esther, or anything? Maybe tell us about this article. Did this just come out in TESOL Quarterly that we can?
It did.
Any books? Tell us how we can learn more about what you've been doing.
Well, that article actually, I think, that's really the place where we started talking about inclusion versus inclusionary practices.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so I think really kind of collectively thinking that through, and again, translating that back to higher ed and teacher preparation. It's like, so how do you get, even if you have only 2 students in your classroom, how do you move beyond kind of the physical inclusion, and even in the, they're all included in all of the assignments inclusion, right? So we're not talking about classrooms where the ELL is in the back of the classroom or there's no buddy system, but at the core, it's just really hard for the teachers to constantly think about the ELL as part of all of their planning, and be specific enough in their understanding of the ELL to be able to do that.
Yeah.
How you get there without having extensive experiences with English language learners, it's kind of hard to envision that.
Yes. So, did your state, Esther, have a TPA?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
Because I'm curious about whether folks who have a TPA, maybe if someone does on the call before we sign off, because the design of that has kind of forced every content area subject, teacher candidate to reckon with ELLs in their teaching and reflection. So I was wondering, and that has helped in our context to the thinking along those lines. I wasn't sure if anyone else is in that situation. I'll give everyone a second. Anyone else at TPA, you could type into your chat box. I'm curious if that has impacted you. Maybe not. Maybe it's just us suckers in New York. We do have a TPA, and I think it has raised awareness. So I think that's maybe Wisconsin. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but I'll send you some of the handbooks, Esther, science, math, whatever one you want, and you can take a look. Because on the one hand, it's raising awareness. On the other hand, it's this ELL-SPED all lumped together issue.
Right.
I think you brought up really well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that to me, actually, if you want to shift from deficit thinking to asset-based thinking, I think disconnecting those pieces, and frankly, we need to have asset thinking for all of these groups.
Absolutely.
But I think we don't tend to do that. I think that's a huge issue.
Yeah, well, you are an asset to the field, Esther. We're very excited you're going to be president of TESOL, and I hope everyone can get to Seattle, and if not, we'll hopefully be able to continue some of these webinars, which is a great chance for people to have access to we don't have to pay for tea to have best and brightest. It's all free. Thank you for your time, Esther, and everyone for coming. We will be having another webinar soon with Wayne Wright, who has done a lot with the TESOL methods course, so that's coming sort of back into our own. But I think a lot of those can become modules that we can think about. How would some of this TESOL methods knowledge where we sort of socialize people into the field of TESOL, how can we bring that to more people in other subject areas? So thanks, everybody. I'm going to
organizing this meeting. That's great.
Thank you, Esther.
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.